Sanae Takaichi did not rise to the top of Japanese politics as a careful manager of ambiguity. She rose as something much sharper, a conservative nationalist with a reputation for hard edges, clear enemies, and an instinct for ideological conflict. Reuters described her as a hardline conservative when she won the leadership of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party in October 2025, putting her on course to become Japan's first female prime minister. That description matters because it helps explain why the Taiwan controversy around her did not feel like a random slip of the tongue. It felt like the natural extension of a political identity she had been building for years. Reuters noted that Takaichi had long supported stronger ties with Taiwan, constitutional revision, and more hawkish security positions than the safer, more carefully calibrated language usually associated with post-war Japanese leadership. She was never the kind of politician who seemed comfortable hiding inside old formulas. Even before becoming prime minister, she already carried a reputation that worried neighboring capitals, especially Beijing and Seoul, because her nationalism came with real symbolic baggage. Reuters had also reported on her visit to the controversial Yasukuni Shrine in August 2024, a site that honors Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, and that remains a lightning rod across East Asia because it is seen by China and South Korea as a symbol of Japan's wartime militarism. That visit did not create her political brand, but it reinforced it. It told everyone paying attention that Takaichi was not interested in reassuring regional critics by softening her image. She was willing to embrace symbols that many of Japan's neighbors interpret as deliberate provocation. That is why, when the Taiwan controversy later exploded, it was not received as an isolated diplomatic misunderstanding. It landed in a region already primed to see her as the face of a harder Japan, a leader less interested in strategic ambiguity and more willing to say publicly what many security hawks had only implied. In that sense, the scandal around Takaichi was never just about one phrase in Parliament. It was about what kind of Japan she appeared to represent. A traditional Japanese leader might have managed the Taiwan issue through coded language, subtle signaling, and quiet coordination with Washington. Takaichi looked like something else. A politician willing to drag that quiet logic into the open and attach her name to it. That was always going to be dangerous, because in East Asian geopolitics, ambiguity is not weakness. It is often the thin diplomatic skin stretched over a much more volatile reality, and Takaichi, by instinct and by ideology, never seemed fully built to respect that skin. The real explosion came in November 2025, when Takaichi said in Parliament that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could amount to a survival-threatening situation for Japan. On the surface, that might sound like an ordinary strategic assessment. But Reuters made clear that in Japan's legal and political context, those words carry extraordinary weight. A survival-threatening situation is not just a dramatic phrase. It is a formal category in Japanese security law that can justify broader use of force by Japan's self-defense forces in support of an ally if the country determines its own survival is at risk. That is why Beijing reacted so fiercely. Takaichi had not merely commented on Taiwan in general terms. She had stepped directly into the legal language of possible Japanese military involvement. Reuters reported that China demanded she retract the remarks, calling them egregious and warning that Japan would bear all consequences if it interfered militarily in the Taiwan Strait. That response alone shows how differently the two sides interpreted the moment. Takaichi may have wanted to signal seriousness, deterrence, or political toughness. Beijing heard a Japanese prime minister publicly edging toward the possibility that Tokyo could treat a Taiwan conflict as grounds for military action. Reuters then reported the row worsened as Chinese state media and officials escalated the rhetoric, and one Chinese diplomat in Osaka triggered outrage in Japan after posting a violent warning on social media implying that the dirty neck sticking itself in should be cut off. Japan's foreign ministry summoned the Chinese ambassador over those remarks. By that point, this was no longer a standard diplomatic disagreement. It had become a live regional confrontation in which legal language, military threat perceptions, and historical memory were all fusing into one ugly dispute. What made the scandal especially potent was that Takaichi did not look like a leader accidentally wandering into a taboo. She looked like someone consciously testing the edge of what a Japanese prime minister could say about Taiwan in public. Reuters later reported that she argued she had only been speaking hypothetically, and that she would avoid repeating that exact wording in future parliamentary sessions. But the retreat came after the damage. The phrase had already escaped. China had already seized on it. The region had already absorbed the implication, and that implication was not small. It was that Japan's leader might be willing to move beyond the old script of cautious strategic ambiguity and into something closer to overt conditional commitment. In a calmer theater, that might still have been manageable. But across the Taiwan Strait, where deterrence and escalation live inches apart, changing the script can be a scandal all by itself. What made this controversy so combustible was that Beijing did not interpret Takaichi's comment as a single unfortunate wording choice. Reuters reported that Chinese officials saw it as part of a broader pattern, and that is the key to understanding why the diplomatic response became so severe. Before the November Parliament remarks, Takaichi had already signaled stronger sympathy toward Taiwan than many Japanese leaders are comfortable expressing in office. Reuters reported that after becoming prime minister, she met a Taiwanese official at the APEC summit. And although Taiwan described the encounter as routine, Beijing did not see it that way. In the eyes of the Chinese government, Takaichi was not merely analyzing a hypothetical threat. She was placing herself at the intersection of three highly sensitive political tracks all at once: a more openly nationalist domestic brand, a warmer visible posture toward Taiwan, and a willingness to talk about Japanese military response in unusually direct terms. That combination is what transformed the controversy into a larger geopolitical scandal of judgment. Because for Beijing, the problem was not only the substance of the Taiwan comment. It was the apparent collapse of the careful, layered ambiguity that had helped stabilize Sino-Japanese relations despite all their tensions. Reuters reported that the diplomatic fallout became one of the worst deteriorations in Japan-China ties in years after her comment, and it also noted that China was already expected by U.S. intelligence to intensify coercive pressure on Japan through 2026. In other words, this was not happening in a vacuum. Takaichi's words landed in a strategic environment already thick with suspicion, military signaling, and great power anxiety. That is what makes the scandal feel bigger than rhetoric. It suggests a leader willing to speak in a way that compresses diplomacy and deterrence into one sentence, even when that sentence can be read by the other side as a public test of red lines. And because Takaichi's broader image is tied to hardline conservatism, Yasukuni, constitutional revision, and stronger security language, Beijing had every reason to interpret her through the harshest possible lens. A more centrist Japanese leader might have gotten more benefit of the doubt. Takaichi did not. Her words were filtered through a brand that already looked, from China, like the political return of a more assertive and less apologetic Japan. That is why the controversy would not die even after she tried to soften the wording later. Once the phrase was spoken, it confirmed an existing fear in Beijing rather than creating a new one. And controversies built on confirmation are harder to diffuse than controversies built on surprise. They feel, to the other side, like proof. The deeper scandal here is not that Takaichi said something provocative. Politicians say provocative things all the time. The deeper scandal is that she may have exposed a strategic shift many in the region fear, but few major Japanese leaders have wanted to articulate so bluntly. Post-war Japan has survived in part by mastering the politics of strategic vagueness, strong alliance with the United States, growing concern over China, sympathy for Taiwan's security, but language careful enough to avoid making military escalation feel pre-declared. Takaichi's remark threatened that balance because it suggested ambiguity itself might now be seen in her politics as a weakness. Reuters' coverage of her rise to power emphasized that she wanted stronger ties with Taiwan and was associated with harder national security instincts than Japan's more conventional leadership figures. That matters because it turns her Taiwan controversy into a question not just about one diplomatic crisis, but about what sort of prime minister Japan now has. A leader can believe in stronger deterrence while still respecting the value of uncertainty. Takaichi seemed willing to pierce that uncertainty, at least rhetorically, and that is where the scandal becomes philosophical as much as political. Because once a leader begins to treat ambiguity as a form of softness, the temptation is always to replace it with clarity. The problem is that clarity in East Asia often looks from the other side like provocation. Reuters showed this dynamic clearly. China interpreted her comment not as responsible deterrence, but as severe interference in internal affairs and a possible signal of Japanese military intent. Meanwhile, within Japan and among security watchers, the controversy also raised another uncomfortable possibility, that Takaichi's rhetoric may be partly domestic performance as much as strategy. She rose as a nationalist conservative with a base that rewards hard language. Saying less might be safer internationally, but saying more can be more useful politically. That does not make the words empty. It makes them doubly dangerous. If rhetoric is both strategic signal and domestic identity performance, it becomes harder to pull back from without looking weak. That is one reason this case fits so well into a dark political documentary frame. It is not a corruption scandal or a private disgrace. It is a scandal of escalation logic, a scandal of a leader whose political brand encourages speech that regional stability may not be able to comfortably absorb. And once that type of leader holds executive power in a country as important as Japan, every word about Taiwan becomes heavier than ordinary language can carry. If you ask what the actual scandal of Sanae Takaichi is, the cleanest answer is not that she committed a crime or got caught in some private disgrace. The scandal is that she appears willing to test how far Japan can move away from its old strategic script without openly admitting that the script is changing. Reuters' reporting does not show a proven personal scandal in the narrow sense. What it shows is a prime minister whose hardline worldview collided with one of the most dangerous flashpoints in Asia and turned a single parliamentary phrase into a regional crisis. That matters because geopolitics is often destabilized not by formal declarations, but by the erosion of habits. Japan's old habit was caution. Takaichi's instinct looks more like confrontation wrapped in legal language. She did later soften her tone and say she would avoid using the same wording, but Reuters' reporting suggests that by then the central fact had already been established. She had said out loud what previous leaders worked hard not to say in such direct form. And once a leader breaks a script like that, the act cannot be fully erased. Beijing now knows she is willing to go there rhetorically. Tokyo now knows that her style can ignite a crisis faster than older diplomatic formulas. Washington, meanwhile, must calculate around a Japanese leader whose harder line on Taiwan might strengthen deterrence in one reading and increase escalation risk in another. That is why the scandal around Takaichi is not trivial, even if no laws were broken and no resignations followed. It is a scandal of posture, ideology, and strategic consequence. A scandal about whether a leader's domestic political persona can begin to reshape the security language of an entire country. And because Takaichi's identity is so tightly bound to conservative nationalism, Yasukuni symbolism, stronger Taiwan ties, and suspicion from Beijing, the Taiwan controversy now feels less like a passing flare-up than like a preview of what her premiership could mean. The most unsettling part is that she may see this not as a mistake, but as honesty, as saying clearly what Japan's security establishment increasingly believes. But in world politics, honesty is not always stabilizing. Sometimes it is explosive, and that is the final dark twist in her story. Sanae Takaichi may not be scandalous because she violated Japan's rules. She may be scandalous because she spoke too clearly at the edge of a confrontation where stability depends on leaders knowing exactly how much truth to leave unsaid.